think I went over the clock up there is a little fast.
Yeah, a little fast.
Yeah. Okay, continue with chapter 9, Luminous Awakening. In the verses, Manjushri speaking. And this one tonight is in English, the nature of the self does not exist. So let's maybe do an initial read just in the Chinese of that first verse. Everybody have it? The 我心. I'm not so sure of the pages here. My pages are 28, 29, around there.
Yeah.
Okay. "我心未曾有，无所以空寂，云何处如来？二德有其善。" I'm not going to spend too much time on the translation. More going to maybe the content. In English, the way it's been translated here, the nature of the self does not exist, and that which belongs to the or a self is also empty and still. Then ends with a question, then how do all thus come ones obtain their bodies? I think on that first line, it's a little awkward to say the nature of the self does not exist. I don't know if you have found the same thing. The Chinese is very terse, but I think what it's getting at is there is no thing as a self-existing entity. The use of the nature here, it just means kind of like as it stands, as we look at things naturally, you won't find a self or anything that belongs to this idea of a self does not exist. It has no nature of its own. So I'm talking about it. It's funny. It's really hard. It has is assuming it, and then it has or doesn't have is already going down a wrong road according to these teachings. So what it's essentially saying is there is no self-existing thing that we call a self, or there's no sort of unconditioned thing, entity that could be called a self. You could also say in nature, but it doesn't exist. It's nowhere to be found. And the second line was, and then that which belongs to this self is also empty and still. Empty. Does not exist. Has no nature of its own. So again, what we call a self and what we call dharmas have no nature of their own. This is what's meant by emptiness. They are not self-existing. It doesn't mean they don't exist, okay? But they don't exist as autonomous, independent things with a nature of their own, immutable and uninfluenced by and unsupported by other factors. So this is what basically is at the heart of pratita samutpada, conditioned arising. All phenomena, including what I call this, me, mine, is a conditioned dharma. It seemingly comes into existence, but actually it's just a passing phenomena, held together by various causes and conditions. When those causes and conditions themselves are in flux and change, this thing that supposedly they support also is in flux and change. So, on one hand, this seems so obvious, and on the other hand, psychologically, we're extremely resistant to this. And to me, this is really the rub. If we stood outside of it from I don't use that word, just drop the Buddhist here, you would say, where is that thing you call a self? We talk about self, we talk about a me, and we talk about a mine. But if you just look at it objectively, almost scientifically, you can't find that. It does not exist. So this thing that we're wrestling with is a chimera. It's a figment of a kind of interesting imagination, but it's not existing really. And so the rub is that we are not in correspondence. We are not in sync with the nature of things as they really are. It's almost like this statement is redundant. Why does it have to even be said? As if to counteract something. But it's only said to counteract a psychological delusion. It's not meant to counteract some reality like, oh, we're denying reality now, or we're denying a self, or we're saying the self is impermanent. The problem is we presume there was some kind of permanence to begin with. Thus the word impermanent comes up. But there is no permanence in all that we can observe. The nature of everything is flux and change. So that being the case, the word permanence is already a misstep. It's applying some kind of imagined reality holding lockdown on something that isn't that way at all. Then we use the word impermanent. But impermanence only comes up to counteract the delusion of a permanence. So again, these words are really kind of more psychoactive than they are actually ontological or even describing physical reality. When we say Iche Wu Chang, everything is impermanent. It sounds like, oh my gosh, the Buddhists have this negative view. No, science would say the same thing. And in fact, they would say, where did you get the idea of permanence to begin with? What do you observe that's permanent? And then we can talk about impermanence. So it's really, even the language here is very strange, how we work with it, but it's obviously more psychological than I say physical. So let's look at this a little bit. The actual Chinese is what? Wo, I, me, nature, xing. Wei Cong is like kind of a, it's a little more emphatic. It's an emphatic use. Wei, not. And then Cong I really like never has been, never will be, forever and always, not yo, having this existence. So that I take that the Wei Tsung is an emphatic emphasis. It's not just saying not. It's just saying like not ever. Never has. Never will be. Never is. Such as being a permanent blah, blah, blah. Again, we have to be careful here because the original of this is anatman. Atman, and then anatman, meaning not atman. Chinese translated as wu wo or fei wo. They use the wo. They did not transliterate this. They translated the atman as a wo, and then they basically use wu wo or fei wo. It also can be called sunyata as emptiness, and I mentioned this before. Having no self-nature, but conditioned existing. Now, sunyata doesn't mean does not exist. It means not self-existing. Everything is conditionally related. So in a sense, when you say emptiness, you're talking about profound interrelatedness or interbeing rather than non-being or not anything at all. Okay, this is really important. When the Avatamsaka talks about the interpenetration of noumenon phenomena, all worlds and all beings, what it's describing is this conditioned coexistence rather than the absence of something. So sunyata means empty of a self-existing nature. It doesn't mean nothing at all. So basically it's saying all phenomena are devoid of some self-existing, solid, substantial, lasting, permanent, enduring being, Atman, being. An unchanging core of or essence. This is nowhere to be found is what this is saying. And the second line then, that which belongs to this self is also empty as still. This is also saying there is no self-existing, solid, unchanging, enduring phenomena, dharmas. So this is basically these two lines, the emptiness of self and the emptiness of dharmas. These are the two foundational, we can call them teachings. I'm a little reluctant to even do that, because I want to move away from these as doctrinal philosophical statements, which arguably, I'm making a point they were never meant to be used as, but they're meant to be used as a therapeutic devices to break certain kinds of attachments we set up. They're not to make statements about the nature of being or non-being, but rather they're to address a particular knot or illness we have, setting up, for example, the idea of permanence. So and then impermanence is set up to break that. But it's not making some absolute statement about permanence or impermanence. Are you sort of following me? So I want to come back to this again because it's all often represented as the philosophical basis of Buddhism is anatman, or no self, making this statement. But I think if you see the Buddha not so much as a philosopher, but as a teacher, and not so much as a teacher, as a physician, then your logic goes, the physician is not interested in teaching you the theories of medicine, but rather giving you medicines that help relieve your suffering and your illness. Now, that's maybe interesting to study this, but the practical and the primary purpose of a physician is to heal, not to theorize. And the Buddha saw himself as a physician, as a healer of the entanglements and knots of the human condition, or the unfulfilled potentials of the human condition. So therefore, this teaching of anatman, no self, and so on and so forth, is not meant to set up a philosophical school of positioning, but rather as an expedient medicine to relieve a particular kind of suffering, a psychological distortion or imaginary world that we create out of our desires and fears and misperceiving. Okay, so it's wake-up medicine. This isn't meant to be philosophical absolute. So the way you work at it here, and this helps me understand it too when I came across this, is from another monk I had as a teacher. He said the way to look at wuwo or anatman or anatta, no self, is not seeing a self in any dharmas, not seeing a self in. So any phenomena you look at is not seeing a permanent, unchanging, solid core there, but rather fluctuating conditions arising and changing and so forth. So not seeing a self in any dharmas. And then secondly, not seeing any dharmas as self. These two, and it really helped me get a handle on that. Not seeing self in any phenomena, any dharmas, but also not seeing any dharmas as self, me. Basically, you go along with, in a practical way, I am not this, this is not mine. This is the application element of it, the pragmatic element of how you use this, not so much as a philosophical belief system you hold, but rather as a therapeutic mechanism you use to break through the things that impede our full awakening, our liberation, and ultimately our true happiness. Because it's in these entanglements and knots that we artificially construct and form that we bind up our essential nature. We bind up our true being, our true potential, this awakened being. And so when you encounter therapeutic, you do, I am not this. Okay, what is this? And this is not mine. So you start with, I am not this. What is that? Well, I am this. I am this body. Okay, that's a stable, unchanging, permanent, well, not exactly, right? You don't even have to be old like me to realize that. The body is a constant thing in flux. Just, your heartbeat, just listen to your heartbeat. It's going boom, 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 boom. It's changing. It goes fast, it goes slow. Ultimately, it stops. Like a bad watch. Sorry. Your breath. In, out, in, out. There's nothing solid or unchanging about that. It's a thing in flux and in movement. Your thoughts, your feelings, everything about the body, about this, what we call the skandhas, the mind-body continuum, is a thing in flux. So there's no I, permanent, unstable, unchanging thing there, but rather a series of very interesting causes and conditions and phenomena that are constantly in interchange. And from one way of looking at it, they sort of come into being, they sort of reside for a while, they start to kind of deteriorate and go bad, and then they're gone, and then this repeats again. And this is like the seasons, so too with the body, and so too from the macro to the micro, everywhere we observe. So this is a particularly hard concept. People used to think that, Westerners had a trouble with this, because it seems to be, not only did Buddhism to Westerners at the beginning seem to be a denial of a creator God, a supreme creator God, and posited pratitya samutpada as the mechanism that's causing the arisal of being and so on and so forth. It's the mechanism of karma, and pratitya samutpada is what's making the universe go round, okay? There's no supreme creator God that from ex nihilo created it out of nothing and then sustains it and watches over it and so on and so forth. So Buddhism doesn't posit a supreme creator God. Our reality is created moment to moment, thought to thought by our actions. So, but even harder, some people say, was the denial of a self or a soul as its most characteristic aspect of the teaching of the Buddha, ascribed to the Buddha. That was even harder. I would say, though, I'm trying to be really honest, I don't know that this is an East-West problem or an issue. I have similarly run into many people who come out of for want of a better word, a Eastern worldview thought ways. And not having a supreme creator, father, mother figure that looks over everything is very hard for them to accept. They've actually turned the Buddha into that. Sorry. And as far as the self, no self, I find this as problematical with Buddhist as with non-Buddhist. And in fact, the Western, quote, scientific view of the person as not a permanent, unchanging, stable, blah, 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 is much more aligned with some of the religious traditions of, say, South and East Asia, where they still posit that, even though it goes against the nature of reality. So I think this is almost universally psychological rather than a cultural issue or even a religious issue. So I would say a lot of the problems could be avoided if we just took one word, and I'm borrowing this from a scholar who's looked into this, and he suggested that we just put unchanging in front of self. And then you read the first one. There is no such thing as an unchanging self. Whoa, that's a little more than the nature of the self does not exist. And so the two-word phrase, instead of saying no self, is no unchanging self. I mean, think about that. What that opens up is not some kind of denial of existence that you get when the first one does not exist, but you get rather something more descriptive saying there's no such thing as an unchanging self. So this goes back to the idea of that's the difficulty of translating this into Chinese and from Chinese into English. If you go with a wo from a Natman, you're having something closer to our sense of being alive and being a person, as opposed to Atma, which was this meant to the audience at that time, Atman or At referred to something unchanging and permanent. We don't have that equivalent, so by using wo or using self, we activate an unnecessary, I think, discomfort, because it seems to fall into nihilism. But if we say there's no such thing as an unchanging self, then you have a different take on that. For the Buddha to say unchanging Atma was redundant. An Atman meant no such thing as an unchanging permanent entity. So this is going further, saying there's no unchanging essence in living beings. And I would say it applies to almost everything within our normal experience. In the broader context, nothing in this world that we experience and know has some unchanging essence to it. And there's nothing in our normal experience that never changes. If we start there, on the pragmatic, the observable, we're much closer, I think, to not just the philosophical, but the therapeutic content of what the Buddha was getting at. Observe and look around you. Where do you see something that is not changing, in flux and whatnot? Remember the story of the mustard seed, the black mustard seed, the woman whose child dies. And she's heartbroken and grief-stricken. And she asked the Buddha to bring her child back to life. And the Buddha said, I'll do that if you can go to any of the houses in the village and get a black mustard seed, which is very common, it's like a grain of salt, and bring it back to me from any house that hasn't experienced death. And so she goes around, right? And of course, every house that she goes to is having someone who's in the various stages of death or dying. And doing that, she realizes, oh my God, there is nothing in human existence, there's nothing in the existence of the world that we know it that never changes. And so I'm asking for something that is, in fact, impossible given the nature of reality. And she has an awakening and comes back to the Buddha with a different sense and really serious then about cultivating, realizing that the wish to have a child that was immortal, which is, for a parent really strong, defies the nature of reality. And it's a setup because you're only going to go into more suffering as a result of that. So in a sense, I see these opening lines as teaching as sort of a sobering statement. It's just telling us, wake up, folks. There's nothing in your everyday, normal experience that never changes. This makes it a little more accessible than saying there is no self or the self does not exist. If I could go on my next point here, and then it's one I'm coming more and more to appreciate, having had relationships with teachers and not just simply texts. Relationship with teachers is like having a relationship with a living text. And this is called the inspired tradition, the tradition of the teaching, the dynamic teaching that goes from person to person, as opposed to the received tradition, which is the text and has to be reanimated in order to become inspired. But my teachers really were, to me, like physicians, psychological and physical even healers, working on my health and well-being rather than working on my views only or what I understood in terms of knowledge base. They were doing acupuncture, acupressure, massage, tissue transformation on my being, really working on it. And it wasn't always fun. Sometimes it was very uncomfortable and very painful. And if we look at the Buddha through that lens, rather than the standard lens that we do with isms, is to look at then the founder as a abstract thinker, laying down a system of ideas and propositions and theorems, axioms, and so forth that are held to be believed in or taken as true or so forth. But really get to this, what I call the more orthopraxic thrust of these teachings versus orthodoxic, which is doxic has to do with doxology or has to do with doctrine. And orthopraxic has to do with the lived experience, made right through the living experience, which is how I see not only the Buddha as I look at these texts over the years more closely, but I see my own teachers. Then much of what's going on here is dialogical. It's questions and answers. It's a student coming with a particular illness of some sort. And it might be a philosophical position. It might be a bad habit. It might be a kind of looking for the permanent I and really getting caught up in that. And so often the Buddha would then, when these issues or questions came up, not give a philosophical statement of truth, but rather a pragmatic ointment, if you will, of lubricating, untying, loosening up. So questions were answered differently based on how helpful they were to bringing about awakening. Again, questions and issues came up. The Buddha answered or responded basically how helpful the answer was to bringing about awakening, an untying of the knot, a liberation. Okay? So some answers are very straightforward. Some were analytically complicated, the Buddha answered. For example, with Ananda and the Shurangama, it's not so straightforward. It's analytically complicated. He's taking through a lot of very interesting steps to get to something. Some are rephrased and even counter-questioned in a Socratic way. Sort of like, how do I end suffering or something? And the Buddha might say, what do you mean by suffering? What suffering are you talking about? And again, you'd go down a different road, but it was answered in a way to cause the one who's asking to begin a therapeutic, transformative exercise. So they're never given as truth. They're giving at that which is in activating inherent wisdom. And in some questions, the Buddha didn't answer. This is very interesting. So some were analytical, some were straightforward, some were counter questions, and some there was no answer, just silence. And this is a case with one of the early disciples who said, is there a self or not? And the Buddha didn't answer. Because if he said there is a self, he'd fall into a psychological state of grasping eternally, hanging on to. And if he said there's not a self, that disciple would fall into a state of nihilistic abandon. So he didn't answer. According to one commentator, this teaching of not self was one of the Buddha's tools for putting an end to clinging, was not one of the Buddhist doctrines, but was a tool, a teaching to putting an end to clinging. And often he never affirmed or denied the existence of a self. He didn't talk about it that way. But he talked about the process by which the confused mind goes about making selves, making identities. And this self-making, this identity-making mechanism is at the heart of avidya, of stupidity, which is driven by anxiety and fear and longing and so forth. So it's a complex. The misunderstanding drives the fear, which drives the anxiety, which drives the desire, which drives the clinging. So instead of making some abstract position, and you can see this also in the Samdhi Nirmochana text, the Buddha is focusing on the mechanism by which the disturbed mind goes about creating structures that it wants to cling to, me and a mind, in the face of a reality that denies it at every turn. So strong is the confused mind that it will cling to this and cling to it so much that it will believe it's actually real. It's almost absurd to think about. As we get sick and as we die, this illusion, this dreamlike figment, melts as sure as ice on a triple-digit day. You cannot maintain, you cannot hold it. It just slips away. The 5 skandhas, it's just like an ice cream cone in the sun. Form, the body, the physical elements. Bye-bye. They just start to do, no matter what, it's a Humpty Dumpty. You can't bring the pieces together again. Feelings, thoughts, even the deep habitual patterns, consciousness itself starts to evaporate and fall apart. And yet up to that point, we are so stubbornly insistent that we have it. We have a self and what belongs to a self. And that's why sometimes death, and the process of death, is sometimes called the last great teacher. Because then we're able to finally get the teaching in a visceral, direct way that we couldn't get other ways. And at that moment, there can be something called death proximate karma, where you can have a resolve and an insight that can change the trajectory of this confused flowing in the sea of misunderstanding, the sea of suffering. Often it takes something like that. Sometimes it's the death of somebody or a near-death experience that causes us to have that turnaround. But I must say from my own experience, this habitual this habitual confusion that really wants to have that self in mind will just knuckle down and reestablish. You come back from the funeral, the body's not even dead, and already you're back into eat, drink, and be merry, and setting up all the diversions, divertissements, and the pretensions and the games and the fantasies and the theater. Me and mine, me and mine, me and mine. And even a near-death experience, you see this. You're in the hospital, you're almost going, you're no longer walking out of the hospital in the car, and already you're reconstructing the desired form of formless realms again for you, and putting your prison back into order. I laugh at it because I'm not laughing at, I'm laughing with. How many times have I done this? in that moment of clarity, really seen it, and then just go back to build the house again. So, because this selfing, this clinging, this illusory making, manufacturing of me and a mind lies at the heart of dukkha. This is at the heart of dukkha. And the Buddha's goal is to put an end to dukkha, not by taking it away from us, but helping us see through it. He cannot. No one can take this away, but can point out. So then the teaching on not self, basically he's using as a way to get us to see and then dismantle. And that's that line that's going to come in below on the text where it says, existing apart from all wrong thinking, all false thoughts. The false thoughts are this construction. So I would say, don't look at this section tonight as an absolute answer on the truth of no self, so much as an exhortation or a statement of therapeutic, corrective, transformative rubbing, as an expedient to relax and release. And this is what we talked about, that all the sutras, not just this, but I'm getting more and more to even what we consider to be the core doctrines. I'm moving away from the Ds, the dogmas and the doctrines, and more towards the Ps, the praxis, prescriptive. That if we start to see these teachings in this way, first of all, it allows us to relax about being, I'm right about this and you're wrong. Get out of that mind. But it also allows us to actually absorb this thing as food rather than just a book of menus. And as food, it should have some therapeutic release on us if we're using it properly. The aim of all that is a liberation from suffering and putting an end to clinging. So it's less, I think, a doctrine or even a school of debate as a dynamic practice. So I will, I guess, stop there tonight. I mean, there's more I could say about this, but I wrestled with this for a long time, trying to wrap my head around this and make sense of it. By the way, this is a lead into next week, but the next verse, if I could, let's read it in Chinese, and then it's a prep for next week. Here we go. 解脱命行者无数无等伦世间诸阴凉求过不可得 Everybody literally translated as the liberated ones. Ones of liberation is terrible English. The liberated one or ones whose conduct is clear are incomparable and uncountable. Using all kinds of logic and knowledge, worldly knowledge and logic, one seeks but can't fathom. This is where I'm going with my next. Following off this, if we see it as a dynamic mechanism for self-transformative understanding and relaxing our insistent grip for self of me and mine, then the next thing is approach it that way. All kinds of logic and knowledge isn't how you work with these. Because even though I say it's scientifically, I would say accurate, to say that modern science, as far as I understand it, even psychology and neuroscience, does not posit an immutable, unchanging, permanent self-entity. It's not there. It's not there at the microbiological level, it's not there at the interstellar level, and it's not even there at the psychological, neuropsychological level. They don't talk about that anymore because it doesn't exist. It's something closer to co-arising, codependent, co-arising, codependent that we get. So that being the case, that still doesn't keep us from trying to use logic and knowledge to make it something that it isn't. Even people who call themselves scientists do not psychologically let go of the me and mine. It's a very interesting thing. If you're a scientific person, really, and you know from your obvious empirical methods that there is no me or mine, why do you psychologically then cling to it? And I think the reason is the Buddha's onto a deep psychological issue here. It doesn't have to do with logic or reason. That's where the teachings have to come. They have to come to that level in order to be transformative. And many people take Buddhism and turn it into a system of logic and knowledge, as a meta system of philosophical discourse, which is, I think, abusing it, mistreating it, and diminishing its real thrust and therapeutic value. But I think that this psychological tendency at the root of suffering is so deep and so powerful that even if we thought we understood no self philosophically, it's not going to touch it, it's not going to remove it. And in some ways, it threatens to ensconce it more. I have sometimes the Yogacara teachings, which are meant to be the application of the yoga, the doing. It's this untying of knots that it's meant to do, often gets turned into a school of philosophical reasoning in Buddhism. I've never quite understood that. It's like the poem, each man kills the thing he loves, let this by all be heard. The soldier does it with his sword, the scholar with his word. And so what should be a liberating, applied yoga doing of consciousness understanding suddenly becomes schools. And in those schools, the debates go on and on and on. And I can imagine the Buddha coming back and like, look, we kind of set up this school to get you guys out of this whole debate mode, and you've turned it into consciousness only philosophical blah, blah. What? So again, that particular school was meant to break through the logic, knowledge, analytical, over-analyticalizing, if that's a word, of these teachings. And applied right, it does that. But somewhere along the line, it can also turn into another school of thought. So, I will stop there tonight. Somebody else is, Jinwei, you're going to... And we'll go into this next week because this logic, knowledge thing, also the text that comes up talks about reckoning, which is a way of calculating as well. I do want to say this, though. I don't think it's anti-philosophical. It's not irrational. But it knows that the rational and the philosophical, although a sharp tool of inquiry itself, also is limited and not sufficient to breaking through. So, enough tonight. You gotta pull this over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The mask also kind of. So can you hear me well? Like, how is the level of the voice? Okay. So I can speak in mask.
Yeah, I think it's
Okay. So Marty spoke today a lot about the self and how the self resists for changing. See everything as a permanent, as a me and mine, and so forth. And today I want to maybe share a few reflections about this, my wrestling with changing in the last months. As many of you probably know that many changes happen in our monastery. We have a group of 4 men decided to live in the monastery in the 3 months retreat. And at the beginning of the retreat, we asked ourselves the question about intention, why we are here, what we want to work with, what is our inquiry that we want to deepen. And people say different things, and we have very short time to decide actually what is there. This comes from the heart. Someone says, I want to learn how to be accord with things and how they rises and so forth. Someone says about learning let it go, or open heart, learn to practice loving kindness. And to my heart came immediately change. I wish to change. And I resisted this changing. Before this, people came, I have a kind of little bit small breakdown. I said, no, I don't know that I want to do this. I want to be engaged with this. It's a lot of work, you know. It could be painful. I can lose my comfort. I can be more, less free, I can say. I can do my own thing. Well, definitely is the big self there. And also behind this, I started inquiring this. And it was probably not wanting to face responsibility. Kind of fear responsibility, even to doubting myself. Am I able to take responsibility? To really be according with the change, what's happening. And so as we go, it is this pretty intensive journey, right? I mentioned a few times, we spending together, I think 18 hours a day, doing practices, classes, learning together, working together, sitting in the circles, and so forth. It's quite intense journey. And for me, it's of course the ongoing kind of reflection and question. In these circumstances, before I was more as an consumer, I can say. I can receive the teaching, what is the best for me, and I can take care of myself, and everything is cool to some extent. And I started kind of shifting my perspective, how I can serve, how I can be the best server, and what I need to change in myself to truly serve. This has become kind of true inquiry in the heart. And I was quite inspiring, and still am inspiring, that seeing the kind of true effort that this people we were working with and being in the process of these different changes, how inspiring myself to seeing that someone's changed. It's coming from the kind of effort, true effort, kind of authentic way to trying be a better person, trying to learn, be vulnerable. Is quite life-changing to be amount of it. And of course, it's not in the way that we kind of creating a group and kind of luxury club of cultivators, but more how we can support ourselves in this kind of micro changes, moment by moment, day by day. And it was quite striking. A few days ago, we have a kind of a small event in Redwood Vihara, and was taken a kind of small group photo for the volunteers who are supporting the monastery. And one of the participants looked in the picture, oh my God, I cannot recognize myself. I so much changed. And it was 26 days of being kind of intensive practice. And it was surprising concurring word, I can say. And of course, I cannot tell for myself how much I changed. Probably others can tell. I'm still in the process of learning. But someone today says in our morning meetings we used to have every day, kind of to check how people's doing. One of the participant says, I feel that I'm capable to do this process. And I think it's quite pivotal, important to doing this, our project of cultivation, to truly trust ourselves that we're capable to make these changes and go through sometimes difficulties, sometimes place of joys and so forth, but we truly believe in ourselves. And definitely I also seeing in myself this kind of that something increase in my heart that I am also capable, I can able to do it and take opportunity to truly serve and take opportunity to learn, to grow and support everyone as same as others support me. Maybe a few words of reflections about current state of and wrestling with changing.
Okay. By the way,
Okay.
there's some theory embedded in what Jinhui was saying here about the personal experience. In other words, talking about the details, but the use of the word faith in Buddhism is there, but it has a slightly, maybe even profoundly different meaning than how we might have understood it. And again, it's better translated as confidence. And there's three of those. One is to have some confidence, trust in the teachings themselves. Because without that confidence in the teachings, this submitting to change could be very uncertain. Because you feel like you're entering water, but you don't have any guidelines about how to swim in that water. But so the teachings themselves, having confidence, and then confidence in the teacher. But the third one, which is really important, is confidence in yourself. So what you were talking about tonight, I think you made a line, I can do this, or I'm up to this project. And when my teacher was talking about it, he says, it's the first that's the foremost. First is the confidence in yourself, that you have the wherewithal to be able to do this. And from that confidence in yourself, you can then have confidence and discernment with the teachings and the teacher. But if you lack the first one, even having faith or confidence in the teaching and the teacher is still not going to go anywhere. And he said it's often this first one that we lose and don't know how to recover, the confidence in ourselves. This is not the same thing as arrogance or pride, but it's almost like a kind of a humble acknowledgement that I have, incredible potential. At the same time, I haven't really exercised it yet. But with that, you can go forward. If you lack that confidence in yourself, you'll be constantly looking outside for affirmation. And also looking outside and fearful of criticism. You will have no way to guide yourself. You'll be moved around by every wind. So somehow the confidence, faith in oneself, and it doesn't mean me but faith in your perfected self. That's faith in the potential self as the ground is extremely important. So anyways, I just wanted to affirm what you were saying, but that the theory of what you're getting at behind here is these three faiths. And correspondingly, each one has the three doubts then. Doubt in the teachings, doubt in the teacher, and doubt in yourself. And knowing when doubt is constructive and where doubt is destructive turns on this. So it's something that's really, really important to understand. Anyhow, enough. Thank you. Announcements.
Announcements. So tomorrow we have, like every Saturday, 7:30 p.m. Avatamsaka lecture by Monk Heng Sure. He's online streaming from Queensland, Australia. We continue our practices every day from early morning up to the evening. You can check it out on our website. And Joshua, do you have any particular event that's going to happen?
Not anything particular online.
Yeah, so please stay in tune. You can also look at our websites. We announce any events, what's happening, and happening a lot. You can spend like at least 6 hours a day of cultivation if you wish with us. So we have
You guys got vaccinated today again.
yes, third
You're the third shot.
shot.
Okay. Well, that speaks of another kind of confidence, but you know, I'm more confident and relaxed that you've all done that. You should be so because I've done that. But as far as bodhisattvas go, vaccination is in fact the action of a bodhisattva. Because it's really not just about my own personal well-being or my fears about some reaction I might have. If you look at the data, if we look at things straightforwardly, we realize that this is the best way to protect your family, your friends, and the world. And so the bodhisattva sucks it up and gets the needle. That's my little pitch for it.
All monks are vaccinated, third time here at Berkeley Buddhist Monastery.
I wish I had a vaccination for awakening. Well, I'll work on that. I might get a Nobel Prize. Okay. Well, I guess the closest we have is transference, which is what we're going to do now. So.
Our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace, with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bowing respect to the triple jewel.